Okay, so now we are moving on to Sri Aurobindo's The Life Divine. I'm sure many of you have commented on seeing it back there in my stack of books. So now we're working on everything that's in that stack. By the way, we're going to work through. So the stack is like a preview of coming attractions. So I've been working on Aurobindo. This is the first time I've really had any kind of acquaintance with him. So this is a first read going through this. But I've also done preparatory background research, so I know the whole vision. And it's quite astonishing and amazing. This guy was one of the great metaphysicians of all time. No question about it. His mind was unbelievable. And he also is one of these guys, like Rudolf Steiner, whom is generally my favorite metaphysician. Aurobindo is very similar to him. The worldviews are very similar. They both have reincarnation and karma as realities, which it is. And they also both believe in the reality of the gods. Gods are real beings for both Steiner and Aurobindo. For Aurobindo, everything is about planes of consciousness. There are all these planes. And between in the human realm, there is the conscient, which is our human conscious awareness, the subconscient, which has to do with our lower vital biological energies, and the superconscient, which above that then has to do with accessing these upper planes, realms of the divine, realms of the gods that go all the way up to Brahman, which is characterized by Satchit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. So he comes in, first a little bit of background before we get into the philosophy. He was an atheist. He was raised in London. His father was a professional, didn't want him having any truck with Indian ideas, and so shipped him off from India to London to get a good education, which he did. He got a degree in the classics, and he loved Western culture, Western art, Western literature, Western poetry. He loved Baudelaire and Rimbaud and Blake, Shelley, Byron, and Keats. That was his world, and the Greek classics. Not so much Western philosophy. As far as I know, he only read Bergson, Creative Evolution, which will have a bearing on his evolutionary idea here. So still agnostic, and then I think he hits about the age of 20-ish or so, and then is sent back to India, to Bengal. But he said that out of curiosity, he had already started reading Max Muller's translation of the Vedanta classics, just out of curiosity. So even in England, he had already had a kind of spark. And he says in some of his conversations, there's a book of conversations where he gives darshan. He becomes a guru, a yogin, and gives darshan to his disciples, where he's talking about how he remembers that once he stepped foot back on Indian soil, he just felt a certain calm, profound energy enter into him. And it was at that point that he realized that he was going to turn to Indian metaphysics, slowly, gradually, bit by bit. So he met a guy named Lili who taught him how to meditate, and just out of curiosity, then there was the episode one day, because he didn't believe anything, didn't want to be a yogi. The goal was to become a professor of the classics, and he was highly esteemed. The tragic thing was that his father was awaiting his return, and then he heard that the boat that Aurobindo was riding on sank, and then the father died of grief. I mean, wow, what a blow. So anyhow, so he comes back, and then his brother Baron is sick one day, and he's lying there on a cot, feverish and so forth, and this wandering sannyasin comes by, I guess begging for food, and he sees Baron's condition. And then he asks for a glass of water. So Aurobindo brings him the glass of water, and he takes a little stick and sort of bisects it like that. He says, "Tell your brother to drink this." Baron drinks it, and then he's not sick anymore. And Aurobindo, that was the first time, that was his first experience with a siddhi, the powers that yogis gain through their sadhana, their discipline, gaining tapas, interior heat, which enables them to perform miracles, and they are real. Sorry, atheists and skeptics, you might as well click the video off at this point. I'm a little sick of you, actually, to be honest, in some of your crappy comments here. This is a real world that we are entering into. It has nothing to do with materialism. These people can do this. And so at this point, Aurobindo decided, okay, I'm going to research my own Indian traditions and see what I can find out. And so he immersed himself in a huge study of all the Indian philosophical systems. And so he comes out of India's philosophical systems and he synthesizes all of them together into an integral yoga, what he calls integral yoga, or the synthesis of yoga, which is the other great book that he has written other than The Life Divine. And he pulls all this together, the traditions of Sankhya with its dualism, as well as with the traditions of Vedanta with its monism, and a passing glance at Buddhism, but Buddhism is fundamentally nihilistic, so he doesn't really care much for it. He just kind of sweeps it aside. It did become extinct in India for a reason. And then synthesizes all of this together, but adds to it and also brings in the Western scientific idea that things have evolved. So this is new. This is a synthesis of East and West with a different preference for the East. He disparages the West actually quite a bit. So this grand synthesis where he has this idea now that life has evolved through and is evolving through a fourth stage, three fundamental phases of matter, and this is probably the influence of Bergson's creative evolution, I suspect, from matter, which has produced from out of it life, which then has produced mind through the human being, and is producing now in the process the same way of producing the supramental. Supramental. It's beyond the mind. It's a new form of consciousness. So these are threshold events, and as far as Aurobindo is concerned, matter was pregnant with life. It was already in there. So that's why it emerged out of it, just as life itself, which he also calls the vital realm, like Bergson's élan vital. Life itself is pregnant with mind, which then comes into being in the Paleolithic with the human mind. And now we have sort of reached an exhaustion of the mind, and we are ready for the descent of the supramental. Now, this idea of descent is kind of an innovation of his in the traditions of Indian philosophy. If you think of the Kundalini Yoga, which he does retain, he retains all his country's main metaphysical ideas. With the Kundalini Yoga, it's an ascent. The serpent moves up through the chakras to the crown of the head, the Sahasrara chakra. But he changes this, and the yoga that he invented brings the higher, what he calls the superconscient, the higher faculties, the higher consciousnesses down into, it's always a descent. It starts with activating the upper chakras first, Sahasrara, which is where he divides the superconscient and the higher levels of the mind, down through then the mental realm of the Agya chakra and the Vishuddha chakra. The Agya chakra is the third eye that is able to perceive the divine forms, the subtle forms, and the Vishuddha chakra is associated with speech, being able to speak, form words. Vak is the Hindu term for the word, the logos. And then the vital begins at the heart chakra as the consciousness descends to the heart chakra, which is the chakra of feeling, compassion, and emotion. It's also the seat of the soul for him. He calls the soul the psychic being, which is his version of the Jungian Freudian ego, the psychic being. And then it descends down the vital to the Manipura chakra, which is associated with power and aggression, fear, and the Svadhisthana, which is the genitals associated with sexual desire. And then finally the subconscious, which is the Muladhara chakra, which is at the perineum, right at the base of the spine. So those are the 7 chakras that he retains with these 4 different dimensions to it. And these chakras are regarded as, in a sense, they're within the body, but they're on a different plane. They're on a different frequency. Each one of these chakras vibrates at a different frequency. And for Aurobindo, the frequency of the vibration is then translated into a subtle organ, which is then translated into a physical organ. This is the correct ontology, actually. This is what I've learned from my studies with speaking to the dead using mediums and accessing the other side, and the things that I have learned doing that have resonated in Aurobindo's whole system here, his set of ideas. It really sort of echoes it and resonates it and gives a concrete philosophical foundation to it. Rudolf Steiner also, but with Rudolf Steiner, the whole vision is much more mythological. With Aurobindo, it's much more conceptual and philosophical, which appeals to me quite a bit. So then that's the basic idea. Now, with regard to the mind, there are these levels of the mind that plug in eventually to the supramental. I should point out also that Aurobindo is the reincarnation of the pharaoh Akhenaten, whom I have written about. So I've discovered this and confirmed it. And recall that with Akhenaten, the whole idea was the one sun disk, the Atun sun disk with its helping rays, each of which ends in a hand, helping the human being in a beneficent way, is very similar to Aurobindo's concept of the supramental. It is something that descends, this helping force that will transform the material world. The actual transformation by this consciousness of the physical body and the physical plane. So that's what he's working on. So the mind, there's the ordinary mind, which is, Heidegger's herd animal, das Man. And then above that, there is the higher mind, which is the mind of the philosopher, the mind of conceptual logic chopping. And then above that is the illumined mind, which is the realm of aesthetics, poets and artists and so forth. And then the intuitive mind, which is the mind that has these kind of Zen-like Satori flashes of insight. And then finally the overmind. And the overmind is the mind of the mystic, who is able to raise up to the higher realms. The overmind is sort of the gateway to the supramental consciousness. And then above the supramental, we have Brahman. And Brahman is the one, what he calls the omnipresent reality that is real and characterized by only three attributes: Sat, Chit, Ananda, being, consciousness, and bliss. And the world for him then is this evolutionary process of this, he turns it into one word, Satchitananda, of the Satchitananda involuting itself, hiding itself, folding itself into matter. And then through matter, discovering life in the mind and the human being, becoming conscious of its originary being, consciousness, bliss. Ananda is the key word. For Aurobindo rejected all forms of pessimism. The world is not a pessimistic place. It's a project. It's doing something. And we are all participating in this process. Through reincarnation, we are all participating in this process of the Ananda, the bliss, the rapture of being, coming down onto the lowest of all the planes, the physical plane, and manifesting itself there and perfecting itself. We're eventually, so as this opening chapter says, man is the living laboratory within which the Superman will be eventually produced as a new species. So we move from Homo sapiens to a brand new species. He doesn't name it that way, but that's what he means. He calls it Superman. Unfortunately, I wish he had used a different term for obvious reasons. But the Superman then will be the transformation of the human physiology and consciousness by the descent of this consciousness of the supramental. And for Aurobindo, everything is consciousness. Everything is, all these planes are made up of different forms and levels of consciousness. Even matter has consciousness within it. A dull, sleepy, dim consciousness, but there is consciousness within it nonetheless. And also for Aurobindo, as for Steiner, the gods are real beings. They exist in these higher dimensional planes. Each one of these planes has its own vibrational frequency, which I had already learned from my studies with mediums, and I was delighted to find this confirmed and echoed by Aurobindo, that it's all about higher vibrational frequencies, and each one of these planes has different beings on them. Devas are the ones that are the highest, and they correspond to Rudolf Steiner's angels. But the Asuras are the negative ones. They are the Titans in Indian mythology, and they can possess you. They can get down into your life and fuck up your shit. That's what Asuras do. So learning how to do yoga to defend yourself against them is for Aurobindo a key thing, quieting the mind. For him, ideas and thoughts do not come from the mind. They come from these planes of consciousness that the brain tunes into. The brain is a kind of radio for tuning into different forms of consciousness and bringing those frequencies down. And when a poet is inspired, he's channeling one or another of these planes, and the consciousness of that plane is coming through him. So that, in a nutshell, is Aurobindo's sort of ontology, his whole cosmological vision. There's nothing random or meaningless about life, which is correct. There isn't. We're all here for a reason. We all chose to come here to perform specific tasks and experience specific things, including death, grief, and suffering. Those are things that our souls come here to experience, process, get over, move on to the next one. So all of this is very consistent. Now, I do have criticisms also about Aurobindo, but we'll get to those. Let's not get there yet. So that was the book one is called Omnipresent Reality in the Universe. And so he starts off with this dichotomy after the opening chapter here, chapter 2, the two negations. And the two negations are the materialist denial on the one hand and the ascetics denial. So we have this opposition that you can line up in Rudolf Steiner with the Ahrimanic impulse or consciousness versus the Luciferic consciousness. They map on precisely. So we have the two negations. The materialist denial is the materialist thinks none of this supercosmic stuff is real. Everything is just atoms and the void. It's a very boring, dull, shallow worldview. And it's totally, absolutely, flat out dead wrong. And Aurobindo says, but nevertheless, we did learn from it. And I love how he says in here, materialism is just a passing phase. Humanity is moving out of it. We're moving on. We're going to be done with it soon. Science was here for a reason, and it was to sharpen the intellect. So that we have an intellect, when we come to this yoga, and we have this intellect, we're not deceived by misunderstandings of the spiritual world. And I don't think Aurobindo liked mediums largely because the mother, which is his companion, what in alchemy would be called Sora Mystica, the alchemist's helper, she came from France and started out with table tapping and seances. And let me just say this, seances are a ridiculous caricature of talking to the dead. They're all about special effects and impressing people with sounds and moving tables around. That's garbage and nonsense. So I agree with Aurobindo that kind of theatricality with mediums is total dreck. It's full of charlatanry and tricks and special effects. Real mediums don't need that stuff. They don't do that. You just pick up the phone, talk to the dead via them. It's that simple, and it's real. So the materialist denial has brought us the intellect. So that's a good thing. Then he looks in the next chapter, chapter 3, at the refusal of the ascetic. Now, the ascetic is the classic Indian yogin or sannyasin figure who has renounced the world in favor of going off into the woods to practice the union of Atman with Brahman. Brahman is the ultimate macrocosmic one energy source of which everything is a manifestation. Its Sanskrit root is br, which means energy, just like the word sounds. And so that's Brahman, and Atman is simply the microcosmic equivalent of Brahman. It isn't really a soul. It's not a soul because it doesn't have any qualities to it any more than Brahman does, except for Satchidananda. That's it. But the two are one, Brahmatman. But the problem with the Vedantic tradition is that in achieving, the Vedantic tradition is monistic, and it posits this opposition between the world as spirit, Brahman, versus the illusion of the world, which is Maya. The world's an illusion. It's a trick. So we turn away from the world and go off and find the true reality. And Aurobindo absolutely rejects this. This is not the proper way. For him, he says in this chapter, the world is real. It's not a dream. It's not an illusion. It's an actual factual place. So is the human soul as well. These are real things, but Brahman is equally real. And so the world is a manifestation of Brahman. And for Aurobindo, who began as a political revolutionary, just as he was learning how to do yoga, where he kicked the ball for the Indian independence movement that is finished by Gandhi. So Gandhi finishes it. And it's funny, he has some funny things to say about Gandhi. He kind of puts him in his place. I think he felt some competition from Gandhi because after a while, Aurobindo stopped becoming political. So he's very concrete and he's very down to earth. Down to earth is the whole idea, the descent of these powers down to the earth for use in the human world. For Aurobindo, there's no point doing yoga if you're going to go off, meditate, and do this masturbatory thing where you just disappear and say, fuck everyone. That's useless as far as Aurobindo is concerned. Yoga has to be used for the purposes of making human life better by realizing these upper levels of consciousness. And so the traditional definition of yoga from Patanjali is that yoga consists in the intentional stopping of the spontaneous activity of the mind stuff. Mind stuff is chitta, consciousness, but the property of chitta is that chitta is in constant motion and it looks out through the senses and it takes on the forms of what it's looking at in the physical world. So it's constantly taking on these forms out here that we're looking at and experiencing. You got to stop that. So you got to go into one-pointed meditation and get it to stop. And stopping it is absolutely essential. And it is for Aurobindo too, except that with the difference is that he wants to stop, quiet the mind, so that you can then use the mind for tapping into higher powers, not dissolving the ego into Atman Brahman. Not at all. He wants to maintain this duality because the ego is absolute, what he calls the psychic being, is absolutely necessary for accomplishing things in the world. And so he rejects the ascetics denial. So the materialistic denial and the ascetics denial. So we've got this dichotomy between spirit and matter that he has inherited from the Sankhya school of philosophical tradition, which unlike Vedanta is a dualistic school, which posits the opposition between Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is the soul as a monad. It is not Atman. Atman is something different. The Purusha is the monad which transmigrates from lifetime to lifetime. It's just like a little ball of light. And indeed, this does correlate with my researches with mediums talking to the dead. That's what the dead are and what they look like on the other side. They're balls of light that are intelligent and conscious. And so that's the Purusha, and it is absolutely indifferent to Prakriti, which is matter, the physical world, which is characterized by three different gunas: tamas guna, rajas guna, sattva guna. Tamas guna is absolute inertia. So it's inertial, dead energy, whereas rajas guna is the opposite. It's fiery, passionate activity, and then sattva guna is clarity. That's what you want to get to with Sankhya's version of yoga, is to purge out of the Purusha, which gets infected with these three gunas, and purge them out, get rid of them through the practice of yoga so that the Purusha can then ascend in freedom. And so he has this opposition between spirit and matter, which he then resolves then by saying that actually it's a false opposition insofar as we have the omnipresent reality of Brahman, which is real and which is the ultimate one, the ultimate Sat Chidananda. That's the ultimate reality of which spirit and matter are inflections, and they're both rendered identical because they both have the same Brahmanic essence. So it's kind of a false opposition in that sense, a Maya thing, even though he rejects the Maya idea. And in between them, spirit and matter is, of course, the realm of life and mind, which links them together. So everything is about chains of linkages with Aurobindo, going up the planes of existence. And then so the destiny of the individual. And so now the individual for him, he calls the psychic being, which is the monad that reincarnates from lifetime to lifetime. But he makes a distinction between that and the Purusha, also known as the Jiva. Purusha comes from Sankhya, the Jiva comes from Jainism, but they're basically, he uses them interchangeably as the monad, which reincarnates. But he makes a distinction that the psychic being is different from the Jiva. The Jiva is the being of control, or what he calls the central being, the axial being of control, whereas the psychic being is the individual that's learning and having all of these experiences. They're two different things. And so he talks about that in the destiny of the individual, and the destiny of the individual is to realize Ananda, is to bring being, consciousness, bliss down to the earthly plane and realize it through transforming consciousness. Everything is about consciousness for him. And then so, okay, let's see. That brings us up to the point where I guess we can leave off with chapter 6, Man in the Universe. So that's a sort of brief introduction to Aurobindo. I'm absolutely thrilled with this guy, reading him. And I will say one of the criticisms is that, as always with India, it's very impersonal. This is a system where all these different transformations of consciousness, all the universal energies, all the chakras, they're all universal. That's the whole point of them. So they're impersonal. And his understanding of the individual as psychic being is kind of cardboard, to be honest. India never really developed the idea of the ego, or the idea of that the West did, of the individual as a metaphysical species unto himself. And so for the individuation process, you don't want to go to yoga for that. Yoga is a different thing. It serves a different purpose. The individuation process, or let's say Jungian psychology, Jung got all kinds of things wrong. He didn't understand the higher planes and the actual existence of the gods. They're not archetypes projected out of the psyche. They actually live and exist in other planes. So he got all that wrong. But he did get right. He understood dreams very well. Rudolf Steiner did not. And he understood the individuation process, how an individual is here becoming conscious, evolving his or her potentiality through time. That's his whole thing. And you're not going to find that in Indian philosophy, because it's an impersonal civilization. Everyone's there, dharma. You perform your duty, no matter what caste you're in, you're stuck with it, you perform your duty. They don't have the metaphysical idea of individuality that we have in the West. So that's one of the things that I think is missing from Aurobindo's otherwise rather all-encompassing and brilliant system, which I think is pretty close, about as close as you can expect of a great metaphysician to capture reality, the way the world really works. So we'll stop there and proceed to the next chapter.